Yes, so of course I spent the intervening period thinking of smart ways of saying the difference between ISO and iOS, like iOS works. But then I decided not to. Okay, so those of you who've been to these convenings before will know that I've presented on this subject before. But I wanted, you will see through this presentation that a lot of this is a naked plea for help. So I'm hoping that this presentation will result in a stream of people saying, yes, we want to come and help the Mojaloop Foundation in its mission to save the International Standards Organization from itself. So I will be available and happy to talk to anyone who is interested and would like to join in our efforts. Okay, so first of all, hands up anyone who doesn't know what ISO 20022 is. One. That's it. I'm great. I'm glad to see that. But I will. You don't. Background? Oh, yes. Sorry. Yeah. Well, sorry. This is background, but not necessarily to ISO 20022 itself. ISO is a standard, an international standard in the area of payments messaging. Well, actually, financial institution messaging generally. It defines the content of messages across a broad range of things, some of which we are not interested in at all. We Mojaloop, that is, securities management, for instance, all of that kind of stuff. We don't care. But it does cover things that we are interested in, like executing payments. So it's something which financial institutions across the world are also interested in. It's an emerging standard. I think it's fair to say that it hasn't conquered the world quite yet, but there are some significant large-scale implementations of payment systems which use ISO 20022 standards. In particular, the European Union's instant payment system uses it. The UK's instant payment system also uses it, and Australia's instant payment system uses it too. Okay, so a little bit of background. The objective of ISO 20022, as stated on its website, is first of all to enable communication interoperability between financial institutions, their market infrastructures, and interestingly, their end user communities. Yes, that's right. That was a surprise to me too. But there we are. Ambitions are good things. And to offer a single standardization approach that includes methodology, process, and repository to be used by all financial standards initiatives. Well, that includes us, of course. So naturally, we beat a path to their door. This is taken, I hope, legitimately from an ISO 20022 slideshow. And it's designed to show what the modeling process is supposed to look like. So basically it says, all institutions, of course, have their own sets of data objects. Some of those are specific to the particular kind of institution that they are. But ISO is there to standardize common data objects. And you can see some of them, like, interestingly, account, which we'll come back to in a bit, order, date, those sorts of things. So it standardizes those common data objects and groups them into syntax neutral message models. Now, ISO means something which, again, I found a little bit counterintuitive by syntax neutral, because you can see they can be transformed to message formats in the desired syntax. So the important point here is that syntax just means the structure of the message. So XML, ASN1, it doesn't include JSON, but there is a working group at present working in the ISO 20022 space to figure out how to provide JSON versions of the messages in the ISO catalog. So it's important to recognize that there's a difference in the ISO world between the message catalog, which is independent of its actual implementation in message definitions, for instance, XML schemas, and the schemas themselves, which are the things that people actually use. We'll be coming back to that a bit later on. And that only leaves, of course, the question of semantics, how these messages are actually used, or could actually be used to execute payments and to define the relationships between institutions in that area. So let me take an example of the way in which ISO perhaps makes assumptions which may not be completely warranted about what is required in an area. So ISO 20002 thinks purely in terms of accounts. An account is a standardized representation as it appears to the account holding institution. So it's something like a bank account number or possibly an IBAN, that kind of thing. And that's in a world where private information can be exchanged freely between institutions which are very like each other. Now, one of the biggest difficulties we've found in trying to fit what the ISO standards are like to the Mojaloop set of requirements is that one of the things we want to be able to do is to support institutions which are very different from each other. And to support them in such a way that the institutions don't need to know whether they are very different from each other or the same as each other. So one of the things that we want to see happening in Mojaloop implementations is that you can make a payment from a branch of an international bank to a small MFI or a SACCO or a village savings and loan association without seeing any difference from what you would see if you were paying another international bank. So we think in terms, when we come to identify where payments are going to and where they're coming from, we think in terms of identifiers. An identifier is polymorphic representation, i.e. we have lots of different kinds of identifiers that we support. And it's a thing as an identifier that as it appears to a customer. So it's something that a customer knows about another customer. It might be, as you say, international national identification number. It might be a mobile phone number. It might be an alias that's set up. It might be a merchant ID that's set up. Those of you who go to coffee shops in sub-Saharan Africa will be used to the saying, it says Tigo Pay. If you want to pay using Tigo Pay, use 123456. That's the Tigo Pay merchant number. If you want to pay using M-Pesa, use 654321. Those sorts of things. Those are identifiers which are made up by the mobile network operators to quickly enable their customers to identify a merchant when they want to pay them. And this is a world where privacy is expensive. We try, as far as possible, to minimize the number of bits of private information from elsewhere that our participants need to know about. Because while it may be okay for a large international bank to put in place the kinds of requirements that are necessary to protect the privacy of that information from unauthorized access, it's much more difficult for a small MFI, for a SACCO, to put those same protections in place. So one of the things we try to do is to minimize the amount of personal information that systems need to know about each other in order to transfer funds. Okay, so the fundamental difference here is that the ISO 20002 data model essentially assumes that institutions will be interacting with other institutions which are just like them. Whereas we want to provide services which essentially lighten the burdens of interacting between institutions which are very different from each other. So, as I say, we try to disguise those differences to provide a level playing field where everybody can work in the same way, whether they are a tiny village savings and loan association or an international bank. So let me start talking about where we've got to up to now. So first of all, we have been accepted as an active member of the ISO 20022 community, we, the Mojaloop Foundation. That is, so we attend the numerous fascinating meetings when ISO things discuss the sorts of things that they think about, which I should say, because this will be quite important in a little while. These are typically quite small scale things. So they might be additions to a list of codes or changes to a list of code. It might be, of course, that I've hit a particularly quiet patch in the world of ISO. But one of the things we're not seeing is any other, I haven't seen any other large scale change proposals of the kind we are making. So we've undertaken also an initial analysis of the current ISO 20022 message catalog in the context of what we conceive to be our requirements. Results are some message types are missing entirely from the current ISO 20022 catalog. Now, you'll be hearing after lunch about the third-party payment initiator interface. And that has two parts. One part enables a third-party initiator like Alipay or Google Pay to request that an institution make a payment. But the second part is the mechanism which allows Alipay or Google Pay or anybody else to set up a relationship with a customer's account at a financial institution. So if you sign up for Google Pay or if you sign up for PayPal, one of the things that you do is go through the process which enables your bank to say, yes, if I get a request from PayPal or Google Pay, I will accept that it does come from you, provided there is some kind of authorization, authentication associated with it that enables me to be clear that it really did come from you. Now, ISO 20022 sort of has the first of those. So it has ways of executing or requesting the execution of payments when the person, the institution who is requesting it is not the account holder. But it doesn't have, at least not as far as we can see, anything which supports the definition of the relationship between the third-party payment initiator, between Google Pay and your bank. So we would need to add those, because one of the things that we definitely can't rely on, which ISO institutions generally can, is some independent way of making that connection. They assume it's all out of band and it just happens. We can't make that assumption. We have to be able to support it because we just don't operate in environments, in economic environments, where it's easy for people, fintechs, for instance, to set up those relationships. So that's an example of a kind of message type that's missing entirely. So there are other message types which kind of look appropriate, but actually have a very different semantic context. So I was quite enthused by discovering that there are some foreign exchange messages. As you doubtless remember, we are currently adding currency conversion capabilities to Mojaloop. So one of the things we wanted to do was to have currency conversion messages. But it turns out that these are actually messages which are designed to settle large-scale wholesale trades between financial institutions. They are, as far as anyone can see, as far as I can see, entirely useless if what you want to do is to support a retail payment versus payment currency conversion associated with a particular transfer, which is one of the things that we definitely want to be able to do. Other message types, still other message types, provide part of the functionality which we require, but are not complete. So for instance, I go back to the account and identifier problem. Now, ISO does have some messages which you can use to set up identifiers and associate them with an account. What it doesn't have, unfortunately, is a way of querying by identifier. And that's because, of course, they think in terms of accounts. They want to be able to add garnishes, new labels of identifiers of different kinds to those accounts, but they're still thinking in terms of accounts. So it kind of looks as if it would help, but actually it doesn't completely help. And finally, there are types where we would like to align, but which have semantic problems associated with them. And those are particularly the payment execution messages. Now, as you'd kind of expect, ISO 20022 has a number of different ways of requesting the execution of a payment. We have tried mapping those onto the way in which we manage the execution of payments, and I'll be talking in a bit more detail about that later on. But we think, in general, that they are not properly adapted for what we want to do in the Mojaloop. Okay. So we decided that we would propose a set of messages which were closely aligned with the existing FSP-IOP message catalogue. In fact, to an untutored eye, they might even look identical. Because we figure that we have, as far as we can tell, a set of messages which is well adapted for the environments, the economic and social environments in which we want and need to operate. So that covers address resolution, payment execution, bulk payment execution, currency conversion, and support for third-party payment initiators. Effectively, the full set of operational APIs that we currently support. We submitted this as a business justification at the end of the last PI. You may remember that I was rather flushed with success at that time, which turned out to be somewhat over-optimistic, but we'll get to that later. And of course, we gave presentations and answered questions at the payments SEG and the RMG. The SEG in the ISO world, it stands for Standards Evaluation Group, and it is a specialized area that deals with a particular part of the payments landscape. So there is a payments one, for instance. There is a securities seg. There is a cards seg. So they are the specialists in a particular area. The RMG, which is the Registration Management Group, is the overall committee that essentially manages the whole set of ISO messages and approvals. So it's rather like in our world, the difference between the Change Control Board, which has overall responsibility for all the APIs, and the Special Interests Group, which have responsibility for a particular kind of API, like the currency conversion, the foreign exchange one, like the third-party payment initiation, the PISP one, those sorts of things. It's that kind of arrangement. So it enables technical experts to work in the areas that they know about under the overall administration of a general group. So I'm going to stop for a moment and talk about terminology. So a business justification, it provides the business context for a proposed change. So it's the area where we explain the sorts of things that we do and the sorts of things that we want to do and why we want to do them. I have to say this was a trick that we rather missed in our original submission, which talked a lot more about content and a lot less about the business context. We hope we've remedied that. But it doesn't or shouldn't define how the requirements will eventually be met in terms of messages. That happens a bit later on, and I'll explain how that works. And typically, it covers a relatively restricted business area. So that's, again, is a problem that we are running into, that it's a very wide-ranging proposal, ours. As you've seen, it covers a number of different areas, and it wants to cover them all effectively at the same time. Whereas I think it's fair to say that the ISO organization is used to proceeding at a somewhat slower pace in relation to somewhat more restricted objectives, hard as that may be to believe. So if the business justification is accepted, then it's followed by an evaluation period. And what happens there is that business area subject matter experts and ISO subject matter experts make the detailed decisions on how to implement the changes. That's where people say, have we got any messages that will do this? If we have, do they need to be changed in any way? If they do, how should they be changed? They then make a proposal or a set of proposals for the implementation plan. And that says, here is the set of messages that we propose, and here are the activities, creation of new messages, modification of existing messages, and so on, that will have to happen in order for that change to be implemented. And then the results of the evaluation are reviewed and approved by the standards evaluation group and the registration management group. Okay, so we are right at the start of that process at the moment in the business justification area. So what should be happening is people should be thinking about the business context, whether it's a real business context, whether it's a good representation of a business requirement, those sorts of things. The messages can then be implemented and tested, but none of this affects questions like whether we should use XML or JSON. That's a subsequent question, not interested at this point. Or how individual markets or schemes will implement those message sets. Now that's done by what's called a market practice document. Just talk a little bit about that, in case you haven't had enough bureaucracy. More bureaucracy? I hear you say, yes, please, Michael. Okay, a market practice document is a self-published document. It doesn't need any approval from the ISO organization. We invent it ourselves, we can say what we like. It describes how to execute use cases in an ISO 20002 Mojaloop. It says to people which messages to use, which fields in those messages to use or not to use, and what it means in the overall context of a Mojaloop scheme to use them. It needs to be complete, i.e. it has to say in relation to all of the fields in the messages that it uses, it has to say whether that field is mandatory, optional, or not allowed at all. So there's quite a lot of material in it, and those of you who've had the joy of looking through market practice definitions in the ISO world will recognize that they are detailed and complicated. And I think it's fair to say that the organization is still looking for a good way of representing what participants need to do in order to meet the requirements. So eventually, we think the situation will be rather like that of scheme rules. There will be a template Mojaloop market practice document, and that will say, in general, this is how to use the Mojaloop ISO 20002 messages to perform the use cases that we support. It will give an exhaustive statement of usage. And it will give also, like the scheme rules template, indications of the kinds of decisions that individual schemes will be able to make. For instance, some schemes may not want to support all of the use cases that Mojaloop in general supports, or they may not want to support them straight away. And it will also give advice on how to implement those decisions. So it will, we hope, say things like, if you intend to support third-party payment initiation, these are the sorts of messages you will use, and this is how to use them. If you don't, then you can omit this section entirely. So individual schemes, we think, will use it as a template for a document that can reflect their own requirements and their own practice. Back to our journey. So we received, fortunately, a list of comments on the initial draft. The reviewers included central banks, large commercial banks, a card company. That's it. And really, the comments fell into the following categories. So some people were concerned that there might be difficulties in obtaining the expertise to evaluate the proposal. I'll come back to that. Well, it's a valid thing. I'm going to take up the cudgels here on behalf of the ISO 2000 organization and say it's good that they thought this. Some reviewers were concerned that new messages were being proposed when existing messages could be used or could be extended. Now, you might think that when you go back to the idea about a business justification and the idea that it just says what the business needs and not what the messages should be, that's not a very relevant comment in this context. But nevertheless, it is a comment that was frequently made. So there were some other reviewers who were concerned that we hadn't cast our net widely enough when we looked at the existing message catalogue. And they proposed things which, when we looked at them, turned out never to have gone much further than original proposal and those sorts of things. Now, this is why I think the question of evaluation is important. So, as we've said, business justifications are evaluated by the registration management group and the appropriate standards evaluation groups. And that they delegate the task to a group of subject matter experts. So some of these are people who are experts in the ISO 2002 world, and we're fortunate to have engaged the services of Jason Pollis, who is a definite expert in this area, and he's working with the Mojaloop Foundation to help us in that area. Others of them will be people who are experts in the business areas and who understand the needs of the business area and are capable of evaluating proposals for messages in terms of those business needs. We assumed naively that the relevant seg for our proposal would be the payment seg, but the RMG raised three questions. First of all, does the payment seg have the right expertise for this evaluation? And the reason this is an interesting question is because all the members of the payment seg, I think it's fair to say, come from banks, big Western banks, card companies, and central banks. So there's a question of whether they have the right expertise to understand what a Mojaloop set of messages needs to do. They also said, are there other segs which should be involved? For instance, there was one relating to card payments, and that has some potential engagement with some of the things that we do. And the more difficult question is, when the ISO organization gets a new set of messages covering a new business area, what should it do? How should it manage innovation? Because I think those of you who have been engaged in however peripheral a way with the ISO 20022 organization will not want to accuse it of being over-innovative. So this is a more general problem. We're just an example of it, but we are, I think, more or less the first example of it that they really had to deal with, which is a problem for us and indeed a problem for them. So the existing message set is based around a subset of the financial institutions of the world. Banks is what I meant to say. It has definition of messages to represent the procedures that they already use and slowly evolving extensions based on a subset of further interoperability. So they are responding, obviously, to changes in the world of payments. They have to. But they're not responding very quickly because typically these things take a long time to happen in the world of Western banking systems. I was charmed looking at the proposal for changes in the UK faster payment system to move across to ISO, when I saw that they were allowing, I think, a year for the production of an initial draft of the messages that they were proposing to use. These things do not happen very quickly. And the existing organization represents organizations which have a direct financial interest in solving these problems, and only these problems. Now, the problem here is that ISO is not a charitable institution. Institutions belong to it because they think there is some financial benefit to them in belonging. And they are only interested in the activities in the ISO organization that further those financial benefits. Now, it appears that, not many international banks have a strong interest in supporting the deployment of Mojaloop systems. Curious that, but anyway. So the RMG is clear that our requirement represents something new in their world, something that they haven't seen before. They're not quite sure what it is, and that's partly because we haven't been very good at explaining to them in terms which make it easy for them to understand what's different about it. So let's look at the question of expertise. There are other possible interest subject matter experts other than the payment seg, and we will be circulating our revised proposal to other standards evaluation groups who may have an interest and may have something to contribute. But we think that we have a set of requirements which is real, which is not properly covered by the existing message set, and therefore it's likely that the groups which discussed and approved the existing message sets will lack the expertise properly to evaluate our proposal. So if there isn't sufficient expertise already there, where is it to come from? And when we ask, what would a group that would be good at evaluating our proposal look like? One answer might be, well, it would look very much like the Mojaloop Foundation, which is a set of people with, I look around the room and I see people who have deep and extensive experience in the design and implementation of interoperable payment systems in emerging markets, which is what we want to do. When I look around the standards evaluation group in ISO, I don't see too many people like that. But it's not a rhetorical question, because one of the things we don't want to do is to be marking, or is for people to think that we are marking our own homework. We need to cast our net widely as we possibly can, and get as many different kinds of people engaged in this process as we can. Now, if that group is going to be different, then we've got to answer questions like, what should it look like? Who might belong to it? And how different it would be from an ISO 20022 standards evaluation group for our payment space. So one of the things that we might want to do is to propose to the registration management group that we should set up a standards evaluation group, a specialized group with expertise in our space. And coincidentally, we have a group of people who are prepared to belong to that group. So I imagine that they would thank us for that. But, you never know about these things. So here's my ask. If there's anyone in this audience who would be interested in participating in this process, please get in touch with me. We're currently calling this instant payments for financial inclusion, but I'm not sure that this is a very good name for it. It's the second name we've had for it, but we need something that makes it clear to other people in the ISO organization what it is that we want to do and what makes it different from the things that they are used to doing. So again, any suggestions? Might give a small prize if there's any limited edition Mojaloop, exactly, left over at the end. See, I'm really begging now. I may get down on my knees. And if you want a copy of the business justification, then let me know. I've spoken to Simeon, and one of the things that I'll be trying to do is to put as much as possible of this documentation up on the Mojaloop site so that anybody can look at it, and there'll be a space where people can respond to it and comment. Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Machin. Right. So let's go back to the question of the responses. So responses, this can all be done with existing messages. It's a general judgment, I think, without specific examples, typically. And it might just mean that we haven't been clear enough in saying what it is that we want to do. But there's something to the idea that there's nothing new under the sun and that payments are payments. We actually went through this process originally. As I said, one of the first things we did was we looked at the existing message catalog and say, which of these messages could we use to map onto our messages? But we think that will come out with the same set of problems. Identifiers versus identities, I've talked about that already. The two-phase transfer model, which again is something that's fundamental to our ability to reduce the costs of operating a system and to ensure that people can get the funds they need immediately because the institutions will support that because they know they'll get paid. But we need to obviously to work through this process with the ISO community, who may not have had the benefit of the breadth of experience that I see in this room. So we'll be working in detail on an individual example of an apparently usable message to explain how we think it doesn't match up with the requirements that we have in our payment space. There's also a real problem relating to interactions between institutions which use ISO as it is now and institutions which might use an instant payments for financial inclusion version of ISO. That's our version. So what we'd really like to be able to do is, first of all, we need a message set for an individual Mojaloop scheme which uses ISO 20022 messages. But also, we would like to be able to use ISO 20022 messages of the appropriate kind as a medium for executing payments between participants in Mojaloop schemes and other institutions. Now, we've had a number of conversations in this convening about cross-border payments. And we've said that two of the main issues that we need to think about are account identification or account resolution and settlement. But there's another one, which is the format that people use to exchange messages with each other about payments. And in this area, ISO in some form is, in my mind at least, a good candidate for a general message content. But there is always going to be the question of what the relationship between different ISOs, ISO versions of ISO messages should be, i.e. ISO messages as conditioned by market practice documents in various schemes. So that's an important consideration, but it's one that we do need to think about, because one of the things that I hope people will expect is that there should be some way of using an ISO message to send a payment execution instruction from a non-Mojaloop institution to a Mojaloop institution. So for example, I should be able to use an ISO 20022 message to transfer funds from my bank in Los Angeles to my aunt who lives in Mbuye, Rwanda. And my bank shouldn't need to know what kind of institution holds my aunt's account, or that it will be communicating with MTN via a Mojaloop space. Now, that's an ideal, obviously, but it's something that would stop us, I think, moving gratuitously, should we say, away from the existing Mojaloop standard. This is an important consideration. Obviously, that leaves out an account address resolution, settlement, routing. It's just a question about request content, but that's an important issue, one that we need to think about. So the core difference that I think we're pointing to here is that existing payment messages are isolated from each other. So the way in which the ISO standard currently adds information is by expanding the content of the message. So for instance, you can send an initial payment request to an agent who will add information about what they are as part of that message and transfer it on. So the content expands in order to accommodate different parties. Our world is different from that. We use messages which are much simpler and which are connected with each other. So we have a principle that each message should contain all the information the recipient needs to act on it, but they contain references to related messages from other parties. For instance, the quote and the transfer message. The condition that's returned in the quote request from the payee and which is sent in the transfer request from the payer, they're the same thing, and they tie those messages together. So that means we need them to follow a sequence, and if they don't follow that sequence, we reject them. And essentially, ISO messages are a monologue. The ISO world is used to throwing a message over the fence, and like a message in a bottle, maybe something will come back, maybe it won't. Ours, however, are a dialogue. We require the responses to one message to be included in the content of the next message. They're tied together, and they provide ways, as I'm sure you know, in which the participants in a payment can agree on terms with each other and then simply execute those agreed terms. So there's a dialogue that's going on there. My bank does need to know how to participate in a Mojaloop dialogue. So we're not trying to make it immediately capable of interacting with the Mojaloop system, but we're trying to make it as easy as possible, whatever that means, for my bank to interact with the Mojaloop system. And that means essentially extending the level playing field to the world. I'll leave you with that thought. So now I want to talk about the use of existing messages. Sorry, you don't think that's possible? Well, okay, maybe PI 19. Okay, so I want to talk now about the kinds of changes that ISO allows us to make to messages. So first of all, we can make changes to the data model, as we saw. Yeah, we can use what's called a supplementary data structure, or we can use the market practice document. And I'll talk in a little bit of detail about how each of those will work. So changes to the data model require approval from the RMG. They are implemented in the main message catalog, which you would see if you went onto the ISO site. They're available for use by all ISO 20022 users, but they can be distinguished as specialized versions by versioning. ISO has quite a complicated versioning structure, which means that you can distinguish specialized versions of the message from each other. Supplementary data structure. It's a component of all ISO 20022 messages. It can be used to define any type of extension to any part of the message. Now, we have, as you know, extension fields, which are key value pairs that any participant in the Mojaloop scheme is allowed to attach to the message to carry specialized content. In TIPS, for instance, they use it to specify whether a request relates to a mobile wallet or to a bank account. That's a specialized TIPS thing. They can do it themselves. They don't need any changes to the Mojaloop specification to do that. It can't be used, though, to modify existing data components. So you can't use it, for instance, to change the length of an identifier. It requires approval from ISO 20022, but it's not part of the message catalog. So that would remain under our control. And it's only available to institutions who want, in this case, the Mojaloop particular flavor of ISO 20022. So it's kind of a halfway house. It enables you to put specialized content in. As I say, you have to get approval for it, but it's obviously a much simpler process to get that approval than it is to get approval for changes to the main data catalog. The market practice document, as we've said, doesn't require external approval. It doesn't support any extensions to or modifications of the existing data definitions. And that's it. Yes, sorry, Professor Hayley.
Required by ISO 2022. Who in ISO 2022 was the CUG or the?
Here.
No, backward one.
Backward one.
You said requires ISO 2022.
Yes. So that would be. I think the process is the SEG approves it and forwards it to the RMG, which provides the final approval. But we haven't. It's not different in terms of approval. It's different in terms of what you are approving. So in this case, you are approving a scheme-specific, if you like, set of changes. In the other one, you're actually changing the data models themselves. So as a consequence, those things are much easier to, those approvals are much easier to obtain. Next steps then. So we've resubmitted our revised business justification, which is even shinier than it was before. We've done some work to show, or which is intended to show, how Mojaloop is already solving problems which we think developed economies will also need to solve in the near future. So greater transparency around costs and fees, which we already have, but typically the ISO messages don't. Reductions in average transaction size, and that's important because it will squeeze the cost of remediating failed transfers. At the moment, you've got a pretty high per transfer average value for ISO messages. However, one of the things that's happened as a consequence of the pandemic is that the average size of messages, the average amount of a payment in the UK has gone down by approximately 15% in the last 2 years. That's a lot. And all of that eats into the cost of providing remediation services for payments which fail, typically because they've not been agreed in advance. And also, there is increasing pressure to open financial networks to other kinds of participants, which, as you know, we do via the third-party payment initiator interface. So we already have that. We're also reaching out to other potentially interested parties to talk about what a standards evaluation group might look like. And we will evaluate what a Mojaloop message based on an existing ISO message might look like. But still, it's possible that we may not succeed, that we may not be able to get the ISO 20002 body to agree to the message set that we want. So what should we do? We could split the business justification into different areas, which is a suggestion we've already had from the RMG. It's not clear, at least not to me, how that helps. So it means you've carved it up into little bite-sized pieces, which people might find it easier to swallow. But it doesn't help at all with the question, what should the messages look like? We could just adapt existing messages and create new ones where there clearly aren't any. So effectively, we could live with the ISO messages as we currently found them. As we've already said, we don't think that's a very good answer, but it's one that we might think about if we can't do anything else. We could adapt existing messages and keep the existing FSP-IOP ones where there aren't any at the moment. Now that would be a problem, I think, for DFSPs because they would effectively have to know how to do two different kinds of interface. There's a pretty standard structure to ISO 20002 messages and a pretty standard structure to FSP-IOP messages. And people who are used to implementing in those areas find it relatively easy to add new messages, or at least to cope with new messages. But asking them to double the amount of expertise effectively would be a problem. We could, of course, just stick to our existing message set. But there are reasons, as we've said, why we would rather not do that if we can avoid it. There's a Chinese, or at least I should say there is talk of a separate ISO repository set up in China, because the Chinese are also doing some work on rather new message sets. Now, they might be interested, for instance, in receiving an application from us. But I think that would, how can I put this? Not do very much for our credit with the existing ISO organization, which of course views them as a bad thing. Or we could just use a cross-network provider to interact with ISO networks. So effectively, ISO networks send ISO messages, they get translated into our FSP-IOP messages and executed in the Mojaloop context. Now, we did a proof of concept for a hackathon last year, which did exactly that. It took a Swift message, which was emitted from a pretend bank, converted it to an ISO, to an FSBI, to a Mojaloop message, executed the payment in the Mojaloop system, and then converted the result back to an ISO 20022 message and sent it back to the originating bank. Now, there are problems associated with that approach, but we know it can work because we've done it. That's all I have to say. Does anyone have any questions, apart from Jean-Marc? Oh, there are hundreds of them.
Thank you, Michael. I have a few comments and questions. I wrote down square peg in a round hole, question mark.
Yes.
One reaction. I think what I don't fully understand is who's actually requiring Mojaloop to support ISO 20022. I know that it's on RFPs for national switches saying we want this.
Mm-hmm.
How realistic is it for us to say, no, you don't? Maybe you don't want this. Maybe this isn't the right answer.
Well, so my view on that is that the time to make that suggestion is a time considerably in advance of the issue of an RFP. Once an RFP is issued, that's it. If it says you must support ISO 20022 messaging, then you don't have a choice. You either say, no, we don't, or yes, we do.
We can always say
it would be
yes.
entirely unfair to say, I know it says here that that you have to support ISO 20022 messaging, but we've decided not to, and we hope you won't think badly of us as a consequence, because other people might be trying their best to fit the square peg into the round hole.
Yeah, I suppose. It just, yeah, I think there's this real fundamental disconnect here between the banking world and the mobile money world.
I think, sorry.
It's almost like this is the battleground, or this is where it's playing out.
But they're all payments. Now, there is a thing, as I say, we think that a lot of the things we are doing in the Mojaloop world that we have to do and we want to do are things which the developed world will need to do in the future. They just don't know it yet. So we need to provide very low cost payments at very high volumes with minimal rework involved. Eventually, people will get the idea that in the advanced economies, people need to provide that too. We need to provide reliable settlement for very small scale payments. Eventually, people in the developed world will need to do that too. We need to protect the privacy of data and to make sure that the costs of that to other participants are as low as they possibly can be. Eventually, they will need to do that too. So there's a point of view that says, you know, actually, guys, we're helping you here.
Sure. Cool. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, Lewis.
Anyway.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Jean-Claude. I'm from Rwanda. So we have been working on ISO 20022 and with Central Bank and with the national switch.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what it requires to integrate with it. Honestly, I may say it's easier to work with JSON than ISO 20022. That's my view. And one of the considerations now to take care of is also the digital signature. So when it comes to standardization, so because like when you look at the central clearing system at Central Bank, it has its own digital signature. When you go back to national switch, it has its own digital signature. I think that's also something to take into consideration as you plan to convert now or to find a way to implement both JSON and ISO 20022. Yep. So how do you plan now to handle this part of supplementary data plus the digital signature?
Well, on the side, so by the digital signature, you mean the non-repudiation signature that's associated with it?
Yes. Yeah.
So our plan at the moment, at present, we include that in the header of the message. Now, it's slightly confusing in the ISO world because ISO messages have business headers, but they are not headers in the normal sense. They are part of the message. So ISO doesn't make any clear statement about what should be in the header of a message. So our view is that we shall be able to continue our existing scheme for digital signatures, i.e. include them in the header. At present, the non-repudiation signature is taken over the whole body of the message as well as some fields in the header. So that can continue to be the case whether the content of the message is ISO 20022 or FSPIL. So we think that's a problem which is relatively easy to solve.
Okay, thank you. The second question, probably from your experience, did you had cases where you were forced to build like a converter, a middleware, just to convert JSON to ISO 20022?
Yes. So we have, as you know, we have a component called Payment Manager. You'll have heard it mentioned several times. And what Payment Manager does is it's a standard adapter. On one side, it looks like Mojaloop. On the other side, it can look like ISO 20022. And we have built adapters which have ISO 20022 message structures on one side and convert them across into FSPI messages on the other side. And indeed, that's exactly the process we went through in that hackathon that I talked about. So we essentially had an instance of Payment Manager that accepted ISO messages and emitted FSPI messages.
Thank you. The last question, considering the efforts required now to approve the implementation of ISO 20022, so when do you think we'd expect now the very first version of ISO 20022 Mojaloop? Thank you.
Well, our original plan was by the end of this year. I think that was perhaps over-optimistic, but I think that we will certainly be able to circulate drafts, and we would not be able to stop people acting on those drafts in advance of the final approval of the specification.
Thank you, Michael. I think it's very comprehensive.
That's John Mark speaking boring, is it?
Quite a complex topic. So I have 2 or 3 comments.
Mm-hmm.
2 or 3 comments.
2 or 3 comments. Quickly.
One, considering what you've been able to navigate, in a general sense, what is the complexity if you were to have an idea of a new standard, say call it ISO 222 M for Mojaloop or for Michael? So what could be the complexity of a separate standard? That's the first question.
Well, that is essential. Well, so the ISO 20022 standard is a catalog. There's a bunch of stuff, some of which are related together in groups, others of which are completely separate from each other. So for instance, if you want to implement the securities management part set of ISO messages, you don't have to know anything about how to do payments or how to do card payments or anything like that. So it would just appear as a separate catalog of messages that you could use if you wanted to do Michael ISO 20022 messaging. So from that organizational point of view, it's not very complex. It would be more complex if you wanted to make it part of the existing or several existing sets of payment messages. But it could be simple.
Okay, thank you. The second, in relation to the implementation options, I just need to get your mind. Where are we as Mojaloop more inclined? Because there were options of, if I get the comments you got from the reviewers, some were inclined to using existing messages, but of course they were asking for something new. So where are we as Mojaloop more inclined as the best fit for us?
We think that we need new messages, broadly speaking. That's partly because the existing messages, even if they are related to the things that we want to do, are extremely complicated. So there are typically an ISO message will have about 300 or 400 data elements in it, potential data elements. Now, it's true that people won't need to use anything like all of those, but it's still very complicated. And again, we're trying to build systems which can be implemented by small institutions. So having extremely complicated data structures that they have to think about is going to be a problem for them. We want simple messages that are easy to understand and which do the things that our payments systems need to do.
Thank you. Last, it's more of a comment. I think you talked about the support for review and related activities. I'm just thinking, I don't know how we've reached out to wallet providers who are not typically core banking system providers. Maybe they could add more value in this review. They deal with slightly different world. So on my side, I would offer, if need to, through our white providers, to provide some extra support. Thank you.
Welcome, friend. Okay,
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
next question. Sorry. I'm being chivied by Simeon.
Sorry. We'll take one last question right at the back there. Yeah, the hand that's up. And then any other questions, please post them on Slack. I'll be able to answer them then.
Or come and, I'll be around at lunchtime and indeed thereafter. So do come and talk to me, especially if you're going to offer help.
Hi, everyone. This is Leanna speaking from Jopak from Jordan. I have some comments and an answer to the digital signature implementation. So we did the scheme-specific changes to the ISO 222. I want to proudly say that Jordan has deployed the ISO 222 starting from 2014 on its RTGS ACH and currently on its instant payment system and mobile payments, the JomoPay. So basically, Michael, what we did with I wrote notes on each and every, while you were speaking, I didn't want to cut you, but for the identifiers, we have implemented the IBANs, the account numbers, the ATM identifications, and the merchant identifications on the ISO message itself. We've enabled ATM cash in and cash out over the ISO 222 through a pre-authorized tokens or implementations as well. We've also managed to convert the XML into JSONs, into REST APIs in one of our systems based on business and regulatory requirements. For the alias, email, tax number, and mobiles are all enabled in our proxy or schema, where a customer can identify him or herself through any of those, and these can be translated into the ISO account number, merchant identification, ATM identification, IBAN, and an account number. We've also managed to do we have a structure for the account numbers, like similar to the ones used in the IBANs as well. We've also implemented the QR over the ISO 222, and we use the merchant ID in the QR and the implementation. We've also considered doing the transfers for remittances, basically using the ISO 222. We're using tags such as instruction for next agent, ultimate debtor, ultimate creditor. And our system does enable this one. So there are tags that would enable such transfers. Bulk payments are also enabled, salaries and G2P. Bulk payments are enabled and up and running currently in Jordan. For the messages and the relationship between the messages, there are 4 tags that you can actually use to interconnect messages together: the payment, its return, the payment initiation, and its associated payments. And also, you mentioned that the code and the transfers, we can actually use the codes in end-to-end, for example, tag or the transaction identification. And for the let me just see. Yeah, for so we managed to actually change some of the links of the tags based on our requirements. For example, for the encrypted OTPs, we managed to change the length of the tag. It's an internal system parameter that needs to be, or the internal system should handle such change, and we managed to do that as well. And for digital signature, we did deploy the digital signature, the business signature on our systems using or by signing the hashed value of the message content to accommodate for the size of the message.
Mhm.
So the signature wouldn't be that long. Basically, this is what I have in mind for the comments, and ready to help.
Well, no, it's great to hear that you've done what's obviously a very successful implementation, and I look forward to finding out a lot more about it.
We've published our documents, by the way, as well.
Brilliant.
And for the telling participants how to fill in their messages. So we have two approaches. We've done a document that says what each and every tag in the message is used for and how to use it. And we've shared sample messages with comments on each message to enable participants to use it correctly in a standardized and unified way.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thank
Well,
you.
as I say, sounds like you've done a great job.
Michael. So I have one question over here.
Sorry. There. Yes, sorry.
So just like a couple of questions over here. So when this Mojaloop started, we had this vision of having a single specification that is being followed by multiple organizations so that the cost of doing an interop transaction is minimized.
Mm-hmm.
For what I understand, ISO 222 specification have done is that they have published a specification that has been widely adopted now, as far as I understand, because there are multiple countries that have already implemented those specifications. Now, by giving them a draft of our APIs and telling them that you guys should do this like we are suggesting, and they have like a precedence of these APIs being implemented across multiple countries. Like the lady said that they have implemented completely in Jordan. They might have done like a lot of use cases. I've seen it like being done in a lot of other countries using the same specifications, right? Like, shouldn't we be doing it in a you can say an opposite manner? Like, can't we actually look into those APIs and see what we are missing here?
No, you're absolutely right. And we have done that. We started off from the premise that we wanted to use the existing ISO messages, or at least a version of them with minimal changes, to do the things that we needed to do. We found, however, or we concluded that actually we would be doing, as Lewis said, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and that there were things that we wanted to do and we thought were right to want to do that could not properly be accommodated in the existing message structures. And that's why we took the approach of saying, well, instead of just taking the ISO messages and changing them in whatever way seemed appropriate, we would go back to the ISO standards organization and say, these are the ways in which we need to do business. Can we find a way of accommodating those ways of doing business in your message set? Now, we haven't said you must use our message set. That's part of the evaluation process to decide whether we're going to use versions of the existing message set or new messages. That's for the evaluators to decide. What we're saying is this is a different way of doing business, a different way of organizing payments from the one that you have catered for already. And therefore, we need to figure out how the message set needs to evolve to accommodate that.
And the thing is, like, if we say the ISO organization actually comes up and says that, see, these are the messages that are already published, you guys have to incorporate it in your message into these specifications. Like you can simply use, or you can actually supplement the data inside the current message specification and can essentially do what you are trying to do, since these PISP models and all these things have already been implemented. And the thing is, like, they have certain more messages which I think should be part of Mojaloop, just like liquidity status. So if you do go into an ISO 222 implementation of an instant payment system, you'll definitely find an FSP is able to inquire about the current liquidity status and can update the limit of the liquidity using the core banking system of the central bank or something around that. That is something that essentially we should be doing, or we should be implementing here, because this is the core to an instant payment system. And
we have, but not here. So you heard earlier Paul Baker talking about the business operations framework, and that area covers the whole question of how to interact with the administration of the system to do things like, as you suggest, find out where you are in terms of liquidity cover, change the liquidity cover, those kinds of things. But we don't think that needs to form part of the published specification for participants to interchange payments with each other. So that, in our world, is part of the administration of the system and isn't covered by the same set of APIs. I'm just concerned that both Kim and Simeon are now looking daggers at me. Can we pick this up over lunch?
We must. I have a couple of follow-up questions as well, but afterwards for sure, please.
Well, I'll be around all week and eager to talk ISO 20022 with anybody else who wants to, because I just haven't had enough this morning. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael.